MMA fans around the world have come to revere the first week of July because once again, it is International Fight Week, folks. Every year for over the past decade, the UFC has tried to put together the absolute best card that they can to entertain fight fans and showcase their biggest stars. I'm gonna take a look at the top 5 best International Fight Weeks ever. Now, it's changed a lot, and the first time that International Fight Week was actually introduced was 2012 with UFC 148, Silva versus Sonnen 2. International Fight Week has typically been a sort of UFC convention for fans, where fighters and fans can meet each other, where there's different kinds of martial arts events going on throughout the week. But there's been some sort of big pay-per-view that the UFC has put on ever since 2006 with UFC 61. Bitter Rivals. Now, the last couple years of International Fight Week have had some mixed results, particularly with some bad luck around the main events, right? So UFC 200 was one of the most drama-filled shows ever, with the main event of Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier falling out the week of the fight. There's been a couple fights that have been either stinkers or fights that have ended with unfortuitous injuries, aka Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 3. But let's hope that the future holds better for us. But for now, I'm gonna look back at the top 5 best International Fight Weeks ever from top to bottom. Now, how do you even judge what is the best? We all have our different preferences of what our favorites are. Now, I'm gonna try and cobble together my favorite events that featured really good fights between top contenders and fights that promise good entertainment value, star power, and then the actual results of the fight if the event was entertaining. All right, coming in at number 5 is UFC 239, Jones versus Santos. Now, it's not the biggest of fights per se. It was not the most entertaining of fights, but it was a very close fight, and Thiago Santos lost a split decision to Jon Jones. For some, they were starting to wonder, is Jon Jones starting to lose his touch, and is he going to be beaten at light heavyweight soon? So the rest of the card was absolute fire. In the co-main event, you had Amanda Nunes beating Holly Holm by head kick KO. This is one of Amanda Nunes' best wins to date, and Holly Holm, a former bantamweight champion. This felt like a big super fight. Also on this card, you had one of the best knockouts of all time, Jorge Masvidal beating Ben Askren by flying knee in the opening seconds of the fight. One of the most iconic, memorable moments of all of MMA history, and one that jetted Jorge Masvidal up into the stratosphere and turned him into a superstar. On the main card, you also had Jan Blachowicz fighting Luke Rockhold, who was coming back from a long layoff himself, scoring a nasty knockout. You also had Michael Chiesa beating Diego Sanchez on the main card, throwing wins for Arnold Allen, Marlon Vera, Claudio Gadelha, and Song Yadong, and this card was stacked from top to bottom with a lot of really big names picking up wins. This was the first pay-per-view to stream on ESPN as a pay-per-view platform, so it's an event that the UFC really wanted to go hard, and overall it delivered in a big way. The main event, a little bit of mixed results there, but other than that, a huge event. Coming in at number 4 is one of the weirdest, craziest, most dramatic fight weeks maybe we've ever had in MMA. That's UFC 200, which was originally supposed to be headlined by Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. The fight was canceled the week of the fight when Jon Jones failed a drug test, adding to a long list of drama with Jon Jones. Not only was the UFC celebrating their 200th pay-per-view event, but it was one of the busiest overall weeks in UFC history, where they had back-to-back-to-back UFC events. The first one on Thursday had Eddie Alvarez fighting Rafael Dos Anjos for the UFC title, and Alvarez won the title by knocking out RDA. Also, the next night they had Joanna Jędrzejczyk defending her title against Claudio Gadelha for the tough finale that year. And that fight was an incredible fight, one of the best women's fights that seems to kind of be forgotten. It was a huge grudge match. They had all this build up through the Ultimate Fighter season. Joanna Jędrzejczyk won a unanimous decision against Gadelha. But then the next day you had UFC 200, which was switched around and cobbled together kind of at the last minute. You had Daniel Cormier fighting Anderson Silva, who stepped up on the last minute notice to fight a future champion in Cormier. And the fight wasn't all that eventful. Cormier took down Anderson Silva and rode his way to a unanimous decision. The main event eventually became Amanda Nunes fighting Miesha Tate for the women's bantamweight title, And while the fight kind of lacked in a little bit of star power for a UFC 200 event, it was the first of Amanda Nunes's title reign through the UFC. But the big and probably weirdest fight on the card was the return of Brock Lesnar against Mark Hunt. This fight, again, was a pretty one-sided fight, with Brock Lesnar taking down Mark Hunt again and again and again on his way to unanimous decision. The fight would eventually be overturned due to a failed drug test for Lesnar, but it was at least an exciting addition to the card. It made the UFC 200 experience feel all the bigger, and it was fun to have Brock Lesnar back even just for one fight. Other fights at this event that saw the UFC canvas colored yellow were fights like Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar 2, which was a really technical display of brilliance from both fighters. Aldo won the decision. Opening up the main card, you had Cain Velasquez beating Travis Brown by knockout. And then just listen to the other fights on this card. You had Juliana Pena beating Kat Zingano. Of course, Jim Miller was on the card. Sage Northcutt was on the card. Kelvin Gastelum beat Johnny Hendricks. TJ Dillashaw beat Rafael Assunção. Joe Lauzon and Gegard Mousasi were also on the card. It was one of those events that any one of these fights could have even been a Fight Night co-main event, if not a main event or pay-per-view main event. And the whole thing was something you just had to get all your friends together and watch. It capped off one of the densest, craziest weeks that the UFC has ever had. It would have been way, way better if we could have got all the fights that we originally wanted to see. It was what it was, and it still felt massive. All right, now to go back in time a little bit, I'm going back to UFC 116, Lesnar versus Carwin in July of 2010. This event wasn't technically in an international fight week, but it was the big tentpole pay-per-view that the UFC was putting on for fans in 2010. The main event was one of the biggest heavyweight fights of all time, Brock Lesnar versus Shane Carwin. The year before, Brock Lesnar had won and headlined UFC 100, which you'll get to see later on this list, and had beaten Frank Mir in one of the biggest grudge matches of all time. They put him back in the main event for the next year's July pay-per-view against interim heavyweight champion Shane Carwin. Modern UFC fans may not know who Shane Carwin was, but he's one of the most forgotten, scariest fighters to ever enter the UFC. At that time, Shane Carwin was 12-0 with 12 first-round knockouts. He had just beaten Frank Mir by first-round knockout at UFC 111 to win the interim heavyweight title. And just for example, Brock Lesnar uses 4XL UFC gloves. Shane Carwin is the only fighter that I know of that uses 5XL UFC gloves. So this was a massive fight, and it absolutely delivered not only the best fight of the night, but one of the best heavyweight fights to ever exist. The first round was all Shane Carwin. He dropped Brock Lesnar on his feet with an uppercut and then absolutely smashed him for the rest of the round, cutting him up. But by the end of the round, Shane Carwin was starting to look a little bit tired. In the second round, Brock Lesnar came out looking really surprisingly fresh and was able to take down Shane Carwin and submit him with a second round arm triangle choke. It was probably Brock Lesnar's most impressive win to date. Heavyweight fights can sometimes deliver and sometimes not when you think that they will, but this was one of the best case scenarios where the price of the pay-per-view was absolutely justified just by that main event. And then you go down the rest of the card and it's a ton of other just straight bangers. In the co-main event, you had Chris Lieben fighting Yoshihiro Akiyama, aka Sexyama. This fight was absolutely nuts as Yoshihiro Akiyama was winning the whole fight by taking Lieben down over and over and over again and smashing him on the ground, tagging him on the feet. Chris Lieben, although he was tough, although he took tons of damage, tried to throw submissions off of his back, was likely on his way to losing a decision. With 15 seconds left of the whole fight, Chris Lieben threw up a Hail Mary triangle choke and submitted Akiyama. Fans that don't know Chris Lieben have to go back and watch his fights because all of his fights were incredible. The dude was an absolute zombie and was so incredibly hard to put away, and this fight was one of the best of the whole entire year. Another fight on that main card was Chris Lytle versus Matt Brown. Everyone knows who Matt Brown is today, but if you don't know who Chris Lytle is, he's basically Matt Brown, but 10 years ago. He was a really good boxer, also with a BJJ black belt, and he submitted Matt Brown, who was a great grappler in his own right. He submitted Matt Brown with an inverted triangle Kimura combo. It was a crazy submission that stood out on the card, full of finishes. And then opening up the main card was another awesome fight in Stephan Bonnar versus Krzysztof Soszyński. These guys had just fought with Stephan Bonnar losing the fight by doctor stoppage. And so the UFC rebooked this fight. This fight went back and forth. Each guy stood right in front of each other until Stephan Bonnar landed a knee and put away Soszyński with punches in the second round. It was an awesome, overall, this was one of the most entertaining fight cards, top to bottom, that you'll ever find, capped off by one of the biggest, literally biggest fights that you'll ever see. Go back and watch Lesnar versus Carwin if you've never seen it before. All right, speaking of Brock Lesnar, coming in at number 2 is UFC 100 in July of 2009. What a massive, massive event this was, with 2 huge title fights featuring 2 of the UFC's biggest stars, an Ultimate Fighter coaches fight, tons of UFC legends from top to bottom, past and future. And the main event was Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir. These two had a history already when Frank Mir handed Brock Lesnar his first pro loss, where Frank Mir submitted Brock Lesnar with a knee bar. The two rematched once Lesnar had won the title and Frank Mir had won the interim title. And this fight had all the bad blood, all the big feels that you would ever want out of a huge fight. It was the perfect main event that had set itself up for the main event of UFC 100. The fight was pretty one-sided as Lesnar smashed through Frank Mir. Brock Lesnar was literally foaming at the mouth when he won this fight and went on to a crazy post-fight speech that included dissing one of the UFC sponsors, getting on top of his wife. It was really, really weird, but extremely memorable and capped off a massive night of fights. In the co-main event, GSP fought Thiago Alves, who was a #1 contender that was tearing through the division. And the fight was pretty one-sided. GSP said that he suffered a groin injury in the fight, but was able to take Alves down as well, and it was a vintage GSP performance. Also, below that fight was an Ultimate Fighter coaches fight between Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping, which gave us one of the most iconic knockouts ever in MMA, when Dan Henderson landed an overhand right and then dropped the hammer on Bisping to create this iconic KO. Listen to some of these other fighters and fights that were on this card. You also had Mark Coleman coming back to win a unanimous decision over Stephan Bonnar. John Jones got a submission win over Jake O'Brien. The ageless wonder Jim Miller was on the card. Akiyama versus Alan Belcher was a great fight. Kim Dong-hyun was on the card as well. Top to bottom, a lot of great fighters that are still considered really good fighters today. Overall, UFC 100 was a highly memorable event that stands as an icon in UFC history. All right, and the #1 best single event on this list is from 2015. This is Conor McGregor against Chad Mendes at UFC 189. Why did I choose this event over events like UFC 200, UFC 100 that were much bigger in scale? Well, because at the end of the night, this was one of the events that actually delivered the most. This was supposed to be the fight between Conor McGregor and Jose Aldo, which had an unprecedented build-up through this international tour that generated tons and tons of memorable clips of Aldo and Conor building up their rivalry. And it was a shame that we didn't get this fight at International Fight Week, but we got Conor McGregor fighting Chad Mendes instead for the interim title. A lot of people were excited for this fight because they felt like for once Conor was actually going to fight a really talented wrestler, and if McGregor could get past Mendes, then he might be able to beat anyone in the division. The fight itself delivered pretty well, and I don't know of another event that the UFC has put on where they actually hired musicians to come and stand on platforms and play live music during fighter walkouts. UFC brought in Sinead O'Connor to perform during McGregor's entrance, and they brought in Aaron Lewis to perform during Mendes's entrance. The fight overall delivered pretty well as Mendes was able to take down McGregor in the first round and cut him up a little bit, but Conor was able to get back to his feet and eventually worked towards the second round knockout stoppage. I think that was the perfect way this fight could have gone, with each fighter having some good moments, with McGregor ultimately getting the shine and building his legend even bigger with his first UFC belt. And the co-main event was one of the best UFC fights of all time, as Robbie Lawler fought Rory McDonald for the UFC welterweight championship. A back and forth fight that saw both fighters taking a ton of damage, with Lawler's lip being split and McDonald's face being totally disfigured, nose broken. Coming out into the last round looked like an absolute zombie. This fight is one of UFC lore. Also on that main card, you had Jeremy Stephens knocking out Dennis Bermudez with a flying knee. You had Cody Garbrandt, Matt Brown, Gunnar Nelson also getting wins. This event was just like the perfect UFC event. It featured some of the UFC's biggest stars. It had some of the best fights of all time. And it was one of the events that actually just felt special. There are very few UFC events that optically stand out in your mind. UFC 200 had the yellow canvas, and UFC 189 had live music. There was a fog over the octagon canvas when the fighters walked out. I don't know why the UFC hasn't done something like this at least once a year, where they do something totally different to make the event stand out in fans' memories. If you're wondering which other events I was putting this up against, here is a list of all of the International Fight Week cards along with the year and the main event. You can kind of see how these stack up to each other in terms of stats like buy rate, which kind of indicates the international interest for an event. Here's the stats also for the gate and attendance for both of these events. Interesting to see how things kind of shift around. The attendance will fluctuate depending on both like the star power, but probably most indicative of the venue that the UFC used. It wasn't until 2012, like I said, that the UFC started the International Fight Week tradition with conventions, with different things that fans could interact with throughout the week. Seems like it's been a big hit. Let's hope that this week also lives up to the hype. Hopefully nothing bad happens, right? Let me know your thoughts on the video, and if you have any other events that you think should be in the top 5 that I missed, let me know in the comments. Peace.